Hello, everyone. I'm going to start this event with a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. Thank you. So thank you all for being here, and welcome to Lives in the Law and the Importance of Oral History. My name is Jaime Valenzuela, and I am the Archivist and Scholarly Communications Lead here at the Daniel F. Cracchiolo Law Library. I will be leading today's discussion. This event is co-sponsored by the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship for Diversity, Inclusion, and Cultural Heritage at the University of Virginia Rare Book School. I'd like to thank the Arizona Law Student Bar Association Executive Board for endorsing this event, and thanks to our wonderful events team and other Arizona law departments in helping me organize and deliver the discussion here today. Now on to our panelists, Toni Massaro, Berlin Loa, and Aengus Anderson. Professor Massaro joined the faculty at the University of Arizona College of Law in 1989. From 1997 to 2022, she was the Milton O. Wright Chair in Constitutional Law. In 2022, she became the Milton O. Wright Chair in Constitutional Law Emerita. In 2006, she was named a Regents Professor by the Arizona Board of Regents. From 1999 to 2009, she served as the Dean of the College of Law, the first woman to hold that post. From 2020 to 2021, she was the interim director of the Aengus Nelms Howry program, and since 2021, Toni has served as its executive director. Berlin Loa is an associate professor of practice in Knowledge Rivers and the Knowledge River Scholars Program Manager at the University of Arizona College of Information Science. Her research encompasses the socio-cultural, technological, and historical aspects of collections preservation practices, including traditional memory keeping practices, archival praxis, narrative agency and structure in archives and museums, places cultural memory and identity, knowledge exchange in communities of practice, and community-driven cultural heritage preservation. Aengus Anderson is the University Library's oral historian. He produces Archive Tucson, an ever-growing collection of local oral histories. Additionally, Aengus speaks to University of Arizona classes and consults with graduate students about oral history, radio production, podcasting, and audio recording. When not doing those things, he produces videos and takes photos for the libraries. Aengus's independent work has appeared on Latino USA, Snap Judgment, and numerous public radio stations. He has also contributed to High Country News, San Francisco Magazine, and Boing Boing. In 2005, the New York Times called his first podcast a cross between the Firesign Theater and Hunter S. Thompson. So I'd like to note that there will be some time at the end of today's discussion for a question and answer period, and I kindly request that you hold all questions until that time. So kindly, please share a round of applause for our panelists. So in an attempt to ground today's conversation, I'm going to share a little bit about myself and how I came to work in archives and special collections. So I was born on May 6, 1988 at St. Joseph's Hospital here in Tucson, Arizona. My parents are Virginia and Santos Valenzuela, and I was raised on the south side of Tucson within the Sunnyside Unified School District. Growing up, I was spoiled. I got to watch Backdraft and eventually was riding my bike, my firefighter costume, riding around the backyard on my bike. I watched the Mighty Ducks and I got to play with a hockey stick in the backyard on the cement. And finally, I got to watch Michael Jordan. I got to wear his cologne and wear his shoes. At the same time I was fantasizing about all these things, my parents instilled in me the need to do well in school. I was told that one day I would be a wildcat, and there was no exception. I did well in school compared to those who I was surrounded with. I graduated from Sunnyside High School in 2006. And as I recall, when I entered high school as a freshman in 2002, I was part of the largest incoming freshman class in Sunnyside High School history at the time, over 700 students. There were 200 to 250 graduates from my graduating class in 2006. So not all of my classmates finished. Beginning in the summer of 2006, I started my time as an undergraduate student here at the U of A. I majored in creative writing, not fully knowing what I wanted to do after school. But I took a creative writing course in high school, so I figured why not major in something that I enjoyed. So I did, and graduated in 2010 with a bachelor's degree in creative writing and a full understanding that I was not prepared to commit myself to such a career and acknowledging the skill and luck one needs to support themselves in writing. So soon after graduation, I took a job at Costco Wholesale, and I quickly learned that I did not want to work in retail for the rest of my life. And luckily for me, that realization was also the second most important thing that came to me from working at Costco, because that's where I met my wife, Rosalina. We were hired at the same time, and she too thought much earlier than myself, came away with an understanding that working retail was not her way to go either. So we both went back to school. That is when I learned about the library program here at the U of A and the Knowledge River program. We were both, soon after we completed our programs, including mine at the library school, Rosalina and I were married in 2015. And since then, we've added 3 children, Ariel, Emilio, and Adan. And going back to the library program, at the time, which is not so much today, but at the time, 2013, the iSchool was very much 2 tracks. It was public librarianship and archives and special collections. And working retail, I quickly realized that, working in the public library environment was not going to be for me. So I chose to take major coursework in archives and special collections. And since then, it's allowed me to develop a unique perspective, an interest in history. I feel myself privileged in that I am allowed to capture and help preserve, provide access to, disseminate the history here at the James E. Rogers College of Law. And I look forward to doing so for the foreseeable future. So with that, I'm going to move on to our panelists, and I'll start with you. Toni, can you please share with us why you went to law school, and was it what you expected when you got there?
First, I want to thank you for sharing that story, because now I know the only reason I'm here is that I was started here in the year you were born. I went to law school because somebody, and when I was an undergrad, they were closing my program, and I was put in a position of speaking on behalf of the program, small program in deaf education. And a teacher, there were only 3, came and said, "You have a mouth on you. That's what our population needs right now. The law is changing dramatically for Americans with disabilities and kids in particular." And it had never occurred to me ever to go to law school. But she said, "Why don't you think about it?" So the power of a teacher, there were no lawyers in my family, we're first gen, all of that. It had not ever, the light bulb had gone on. What they put on a bigger pedestal was teacher, doctor, those kind of it. So that's what happened. And there's a longer version, but if you want that, go to the oral history where they have done this project, and the whole bloody story's there. But I want to say, when we get to the project, this wouldn't have happened without him. And the amount of work that went into it by people, I'll tell you about a little bit. And I think it's so important. So thank you for this labor and vision and opportunity for those people we interviewed for their voices to be heard. And I can only hope that some students learn more about themselves by listening to these lawyers talk about their careers.
Thank you. And believe me, it is the law library's pleasure to be doing this work. Aengus, you obtained multiple degrees in history. Why the pursuit to begin with, and what inspired you to focus on oral history in your career? There's a speaker in here. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what is valuable for me about history is that it makes the present weird, right? we live in this world, we live kind of ahistorically. Today feels like it sort of always has been. We have a bias towards what we're seeing and feeling right now. And the more you study history, the more you read about the past, and certainly the more you talk to people about the past, the more you feel like, oh, it was really different just yesterday. You know, and you go a little further back and it gets weirder and weirder, and then the present starts getting weirder. So you're like, it could have been nothing. You know, you get all of the forks, all of the contingencies. So for me, that was a big part of it. It was starting as a kid, reading history, because it's like, oh, this is a way to like travel and explore and learn about other places. And then you get into it more and you're like, this is just making me feel like the world I am now is really bizarre. And so I think that's part of it. And I think once you start to think about that, you think more critically about just the everyday now. How could it be? How would I rather it was? Are there other models? So I just feel like living without history is sort of like living without memory. And as you wouldn't want to do that necessarily in your personal life, I feel like you don't really want to do that when you think about your society either, right? Like I want to know what I was doing 10 years ago because it helps me understand who I am now. I want to know what was going on in American politics 50 years ago. Yeah.
Thank you. Berlin, you have degrees in anthropology and archives. Which pursuit came first, and when did you first encounter oral history in your work?
Which came first? I don't know if I can parse out which came first. I think they sort of came hand in hand. I've always been an interdisciplinary scholar from my very early days. In fact, my undergrad is in English Lit, but I was in anthropology as well, even though the English professors weren't really happy about that. But hopefully there are none of them in this room. So I've always sort of delved in all of these different areas, and I think anthropology and archives came together when I was in the English Lit program and started being exposed to some of the ethnographies and sort of creative fiction and creative literature that folks were writing. And I sort of took an anthropological lens looking at those as ethnographies of those periods of time. So I think I just sort of took that route and then decided that, I wanted to supplement what I was learning in English Lit with anthropology. And so then I went on to advanced degrees. And the way I ended up in archives is because I was doing research on Zora Neale Hurston. And the way to do that, of course, was to go to the archives and figure out what was really going on. And so I just, I was sort of elbow deep in the archives and started looking around and I was like, I can do this. Like, this is the thing, right? It was not something that I had been exposed to as a youth or as in high school or even in undergrad until I started doing the research and realized, oh, this is a field that folks are part of. And yeah, I think that answers the question.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, so I was hopeful that this opening line of questions would just kind of ground everybody and just share a little bit of our history before we talk about the project here today. And so with that, I'm going to share a definition of oral history according to the Dictionary of Archives Terminology as created and maintained by the Society of American Archivists. 1, an interview that records an individual's personal recollection of the past and historical events. 2, the audio or video recordings, transcripts, and other materials that capture and are associated with such an interview. Berlin. One of your research interests includes the application of storytelling and cultural heritage preservation. What do you see as the differences between storytelling and oral histories?
Well, I think there are a lot of similarities. I think they're very parallel. But storytelling is, it's an ancient craft, right? It's something as old as humankind. It's something that we find in every known culture. There is some type of storytelling, usually an oral story. Or some sort of memory keeping tool that we use to record these stories. And well before technology, right? We have memory sticks, we have Kipu, we have oral stories, we have that kind of thing. So it's always been part of human culture to tell stories. And I think they're a type of memory keeping structure that is dynamic, and there are layers upon layers as these are passed down upon generations. So we can think of storytelling as a type of archive, but there are all sorts of different ways that we can look at how stories represent culture and knowledge and spirituality and art and all of those kind of things. And then I look at oral history and I think it's a way that we've developed to capture those moments of culture, those moments of storytelling. So they are very parallel, but I don't see them as the same thing. In fact, I think oral history, it, and maybe especially this project, are an example of testimony and maybe even legacy. So I think that's how I would differentiate them. So I think, maybe oral history is a tool of storytelling, and especially in the last century or so that we've had the technology to capture these things in the way that we have.
It's great. Yeah. And I myself, recall being smaller with my sibling, my sister, and my cousins, my dad sharing tales of La Llorona. And though that's not necessarily the storytelling that I would think specifically comes to mind when you're thinking of oral history, but still that type of story can get lost if it's not shared with those to come. So Aengus, what are some of the more popular recording formats today, and how do you prefer to capture an oral history?
So I think, I don't know, record on any format you have available and just get it done. I think any format you're using now is going to be good enough to capture the essence of what people are saying. And so when I talk to people, like if I'm consulting with professors or grad students about like, what should I use? And I just say, I can give you a lot of recommendations for here, and I can tell you how to set it up. But fundamentally, don't let that be the hang up that prevents you from doing this. Whatever you do now is going to be better than the 1930s wire recording. And people use those all the time, when we go back to the archives, and they're still plenty good. So it's like, if it's your iPhone, fine, your iPhone. Within that, I'll say that I only do audio. And even though I've done video work as someone who worked in post-production for advertising agencies, I'm very used to working with video. When I do oral history, I do audio only. And people always bother me about this. Why are you not doing video? Wouldn't it be nice, after the fact, someone gets the file and they're like, I really wish I had video. And it's like, the story is better this way. I record audio because people are more comfortable when there isn't a lens in their face. And what I do is often very personal oral history. I sit down with people and I sit down for a really long time. And I don't have an agenda. I have this odd oral history project where it's sort of like, we can do a lot of different things with it based on what the interviewee wants to do. And so sometimes it is personal and I don't want the lens there, and I want the stories about Tucson. So I could tell you about formats and degradation and loss of media quality, but I fundamentally don't think that stuff matters much. It's all going to get scraped by AI and just turned into text by machines, right? So it's like, that's what's happening.
Right.
So just record it.
Thank you, Aengus. So with that, I'm going to detail the Lives in the Law project as I came to know it, seeing the collection first in our stacks on VHS and DVD tapes, to then coming across the actual mini DVs, a popular recording carrier at the time in the late 90s, early 2000s from Toni Massaro. So the Lives in the Law was an oral history project that was initiated by Dean Massaro. Interviews were completed in the late 90s and early 2000s over the course of 3 years. There were over 50 participants in the Lives in the Law project. Among those 50 participants, over 40 were College of Law alum. Among them were Maria Borbon, class of 1987 and 2002. Maria was part of the first graduating class of the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy program. Jan Wesselman, class of 1974. Jan was one of the first women to ever serve on the Arizona Law Review editorial board. Raul H. Castro, class of 1949. Raul was the first Latino governor here in the state of Arizona, and of course the Law Library chooses to have a permanent display to honor Governor Castro on the lower level of the library now. Also included is the late J. Michael Hennigan, class of 1970. Michael's name now graces the J. Michael Hennigan Courtroom as part of the James E. Rogers College of Law a New Day in Court initiative. The earliest graduate to participate in the project was the late Ashby Los, class of 1939. He was interviewed by Dean Massaro on December 7th, 1999. The most recent graduate to participate in the project was Nicole Davis, class of 1999. She was interviewed by Elizabeth Townsend on February 24th, 2000. Elizabeth Townsend, now Elizabeth Townsend Guard, was a student at the time of the project and conducted the majority of the interviews. Elizabeth graduated in 2002 and is now the John E. Corner Endowed Professor of Law at Tulane University Law School. The Lives in the Law collection contains over 3,000 minutes of interview time and was originally recorded on the mini DV. In the summer of 2021, the library obtained the mini DVs from Dean Massaro, and at the time, the Lives of the Law collection was only available in an analog format through the means of the VHS and DVD tapes, DVDs that I mentioned previously. The digital MP4 files we received after we outsourced them for digitization are now fully accessible on the Cracchiolo Law Library YouTube page. So with that, Toni, what inspired the Lives in the Law project, and did it have the impact that you hoped that it would?
Right now, thanks, Steve. History matters. I went to William and Mary Law School. Again, first gen, didn't know anything. You could not escape the importance of it. We would walk down Duke of Gloucester Street and be astonished and appalled at people dressed in 18th century clothing. They'd also be at Piggly Wiggly and at the bank. I mean, it was like they submerged in it. You know, Marshallwood School of Law is the first chair of law in the United States. And so history was palpable. Of course, the pictures were almost exclusively white men from long ago, but they instilled in us tremendous pride in being part of the William and Mary legacy. So that was in the background. When I got here, it's the first place I unpacked. Never bought a house or anything. And I applied to U of A, and I was mocking Young and Kello. We had these horrible portraits of past deeds. One was more freakish than the next, and one particularly gothic. And I was standing in front of it being a jerk and going, oh, who's that, et cetera, et cetera. And an older colleague, who's now a very, very close friend, who was never harsh with anyone, interrupted me and said, that's your history. And they really didn't know anything. I was, back in the tunnel, and I paid attention. I was not Dean. And so, but that made a real impression on me. This was Dean Fetley, who spoke particular painting I found ghoulish, but I didn't know anything about it. Or J. Byron McCormick, or all these people who had spilled a lot of their energy on the creation of this place. In particular, Charles Ayres, but still, I was learning. So then I became dean, and I thought, a lot of the students here, part of why I liked it, there were a lot of first gens. And I thought, you go west of the Mississippi, and it's great because you're liberated from history in a way. But there's, of course, pre-existing important histories which you began with the land acknowledgement. I mean, and I don't think history is where you go to find answers, but questions. In the ways in which some people abuse history, but when it's your own, I think you will begin to understand a lot of things around your language, gestures, what this means, how this came to be, who, what, when it all happened, and then you see yourself as part of this moving mosaic. But we then thought they don't know, and to know, I thought, might give them a sense of pride, give us a closer sense of community, and I'll be frank, public law school, the assumption is that the government pays for everything we do. It was a lie then, and it's a hopeless lie now. So the only way that we can survive is to see ourselves as part of a collective project, and to get those when they can to think about ways in which to help the students who come after them. But right in the beginning, I wanted them to see who they were. And there were more than multiple. We did the Lives in the Law is one fraction. It was very amateurish. What we did with this, et cetera. Almost everything was done by my partner, Genevieve Levitt, and then turned it into hundreds of time. And then creating CDs and all these things. And Jared did it. Vicki Fleischer, who is then the head of development here. She's now a big SVP, who's a magnificent human being, and the formidable Elizabeth Townsend, who had history in doing it sort of thing and doing it right. So we had somebody who understood something about ethnography. And so it was just the four of us doing this. And the interviews were transported. The ones you named, I literally want to go to tears, thinking of the one with Governor Castro as an example, but also Jan. I could still hear her voice, everything. Eileen Howell, Justin, Barbara Atwood. We interviewed prior faculty. She's also a grad, with the deans, et cetera. And I thought this is so rich. To learn it is to change. And I feel like we're all, it's like Groundhog Day. You know, people waking up here now, they have no idea where they are or who they are, right? But it was Arthur Andrews saying this to me that made me think, I don't know. And if I want to live here, I want to live here and try to understand. So that was it. We did these, and there were 4 things. We created something that was shown, at least while I was dean at orientation. It's called a history of you. We wanted the students to meet some of these folks, to talk about the law school that was drawn from this reservoir. And I thought it was great, but these things come and go with changes in what you think the kids want to see when they get.
We have that too.
Yeah, well, thank you. You don't know how happy with Jerry. Lives in the law was different. After meeting with the line after a while, they said, here, you at the law school, you're teaching them sort of contracts, courts, et cetera, but you don't teach them what it's really like to be a lawyer. And they don't know, they get their expectations of firms. So I thought, let's find out. So we started this, we have them for the first 3 years, but it's sort of when we get them to about 8 years from then, I think that's where so much of the information happens. We thought we could jumpstart something. So we interviewed key people and then pulled from these things, not just what you have the raw data, but here's what it's like to work in a private firm. Here's what it's like to work for the AG's office. Here it's kind of a beyond the curriculum, things that are taught. And we thought that it might be useful. We just flunked at the door of incorporating and operationalizing what had been created. But I mean, that's there now. Somebody might do something with it that we can't foresee. Jerry's background, she has a master's degree in historical archaeology and interested in genealogy, everything. So she wasn't just a camera person, but also somebody who understood what this could be. You know, and it's history, not storytelling. We didn't think of it in that light, but of course, a great way to get a history is to actually tell a story. So Lives in the Law, a history of us. I did a whole book on one guy, Dan Frost. That was $1 billion of listening. And he was a part of our history, a very prominent grad who had reshaped private law firms. And I thought that it would be an important story to have. It's not a great book, but his story was worth telling. You know, it's starting to put on the shelf these memories. The last thing is, you look at those lab photos, that's thanks to, I think, Roger Henderson, former Dean Henderson started that. If you walk down the red hallway, you see pictures of these amazing people. Again, Barbara was one of them. If you knew the backstory of every single one of them, you'd say, why did they interview those folks too? And I regret some are already gone, but they all had big stories to tell, and they're all part of us. And every classroom, when we redid the building, has a switchblade on it, where I asked the firm who donated the money, what do you want the students to learn? And I think we just walked by it. This is the Charles Ayres classroom. If you knew that story, it's not room 164, right? And these things are not meant to honor people who give money, but to tell you something about who's come before and what their aspirations were. And then maybe you might be motivated to not let the story stop, you know, in 2009, whatever, that you're going to have to dig in. So each classroom, the Hall of Fame, et cetera, et cetera. I thought that if they knew that, they'd get a little something that I thought was really beneficial from William and Mary. I'm in 5th grade. One of the best teachers I ever had, and had a social studies book in history. And in it was a picture of Williamsburg. I didn't know where, Wisconsin, you know, but we could have drawn a circle around places that I'd seen, except that Mom and Dad took us on a trip. I looked at the picture and something strange happened, and then I'm going to and you know, why? You know, what? And when I did, I felt like, you know, they were in the book, and somehow, I don't know, it was almost utter. But when I got this, I'm not going to miss this opportunity. And then I looked at another book and said, here's one I'm living forever. Arizona. That's a longer story. But I thought Arizona is the geological time, what Rome is the human time. And maybe William and Mary was in a lesser way to the legal time once they're paying attention to only a certain type of law being practiced. It matters. It matters. And I wanted them to be proud. And I wanted them to meet these other people. We have one guy. He was in one of my first classes. He was general counsel for Dominion. You know, Dominion. He was just here last year telling his story that we gotta get that story, right? And he was just sitting out there in Panama too, and then drifted downstairs when there was a hole rather than the library. So this little thing, I thought maybe I'll go work for the election office. He's the one who brought the lawsuit that where they recovered north of $700 million against Fox News. That's part of U of A's history, right? Everybody ever taught here is everybody ever learned here, and I want them to feel that they belong, because not feeling like you do, you'll miss out on what you can contribute, why we need you, etc. So that's, I thought that was my job as dean, was to make the community more of a community. We needed it. And the last thing is that when you're a faculty person and a student, you can tunnel. But in that job, you can't ignore everything happening. Sometimes, some days you don't want to know. And I just thought these stories aren't getting out there. Did we succeed? No, we did not. And it was a big regret. So, but we did do the work. They did the work. Those women did the work. And so we'll see. Maybe somebody finds it one day and takes what he's done, and maybe someone who's directed to it. You have to, it has to be there. It has to be accessible to us and tell you where it is. Right. So I want to thank again the library. I feel like you and Teresa, that the place of understanding the educational function of the library. And I think probably your experience at Yale, that's another place where Carol Rose, who taught here and there, called it Mother Yale. I want our students to, I don't know, Mother, that's a little much, but maybe Auntie Yale. Auntie Arizona. I like Auntie. Okay.
Thank you.
That's it. That's what I like. That's what we were trying.
Thank you, Toni. And I believe this is the first time where I've had the opportunity to engage with you in a conversation longer than 2 minutes. So I hope everybody enjoys the time with Toni here today. And before I turn over to Aengus, I'd also like to share that I had the privilege of being interviewed by Aengus when I was in graduate school. He asked me a few questions and recorded me going through the Egyptian expedition stacks, where I was responsible for helping organize the library over there. So Aengus, and you've kind of touched on this already, but perhaps you can expand a little. Why do you think oral history is important? And please speculate, why do you think others find oral history valuable?
I think something I like about oral history captures all of this like ephemera that nobody else bothers to record. And I think, if you spend time in the archive, we get a lot of papers, and I'm thinking about special collections at U of A because I work with them all the time. We've got all these papers about information, statistics, stuff from congressional laws. And when I do oral histories with people, I ask them, how did it feel? What did it look like? What did it sound like? All the stuff that that is not going to be in any of those papers. It's like, so I may talk to somebody who is historically interesting, and I always try to go into these things and think, well, there are all these obvious questions I could ask them about their career, but I really want to get into the stuff that I suspect is not going to get recorded elsewhere. And so the really intangible, the subjective, the human response stuff, I think that is really a place where oral history shines because this doesn't get captured. Another obvious one is that oral history gets people who don't leave written records, and there are a lot of them. And so I do Tucson, basically Tucson, some around Tucson. And so I try to talk to, I talk to people who obviously could leave archives with special collections, but I also try to get a whole lot of people who would never ever write anything down to say oh, what was it like in this neighborhood as a kid? Because that stuff, And another fun thing about oral history is it doesn't add up. right? So I've talked to people about a very similar thing that tell me really different stories. And you think, well, there's no way to square this. You can then go to the data and you can start figuring out which of these stories you want to believe more. Or you can do some more oral histories, but you get all of this stuff where you're like, I actually feel like a lot of this past stuff that's subjectively is not accessible anymore. And we're just getting these oddball pieces, but it does help you think about it. So I think there's a lot of stuff that comes out of it. And it's not dates, you know, you never ask for dates. That just clusters people. Dates are, you go to the, as a historian, I can say this, you go to the data, you go to the written records, those may be fabricated, but at least they're steady over time once they're fabricated. These memories just change all the time. And that's part of what makes them fun. I listened to some of the law oral histories here because there are people like Richard Davis who I've interviewed as well. And I've heard interviews with Richard Davis elsewhere. And these interviews may be spaced decades apart. And I love going to areas where maybe the interviewee talks about something that I talked to them about. And 20 years earlier, they thought about it differently. And that's very intriguing to me. So there's a place for oral history in that too. You're really capturing someone in a moment. And that makes it unreliable in some ways, but it makes it really interesting.
Thank you, Angus. Berlin, before I turn to you, I'll just share that Berlin now, as I said previously when I introduced her, she manages the Knowledge River program here. And I've known Berlin for a few years now. And as a Knowledge River scholar, I just want to thank her for her continued work and support of the program. So Berlin, how do you think an oral history collection and a project like Lives in the Law can help shape communities both within the College of Law and the broader areas we serve as a university?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think both Angus and Toni have touched on is how oral histories sort of start to build a narrative around a subject, right? So building history, building narrative, sort of building this knowledge around things that might otherwise be missed, primarily in archives and museums. But I think to Angus's point about the sort of ephemera, I was listening to the Raul Castro interview a couple of days ago. And I think it was either him or Liz who mentioned that one of the I guess the original owner and founder of the Thing, which you find on the I-10 going east, is a graduate of the law library. So it builds a narrative, but which is to your point about people knowing their own history, but it also provides these sort of ephemeral facts, right? That now this is sort of a thing that I can mention when I'm out and about and need something to talk about or to talk to a partner, but it also points back to the oral histories. So when you are able to talk about these types of ephemeral things or the history of a department, the history of the people who grew up in the department, you point back to the oral history and show people that this is where you get access to, where the collections are, that kind of thing. So I think it's really valuable in that way. The fun facts, the ephemera, the building the narrative around the history. And I think the other thing it does is it starts to build or maybe reinforce the collective memory that we build around things, the sort of foundational societal memory of our past, right? And so, Angus, you mentioned that sometimes when you interview people decades apart, that they think of things differently. So you can look at the way that sort of this cultural memory existed 20 years ago, and then you fast forward to now, and there's a whole different sort of feeling around that history. So I think it's really valuable for that. But those were great interviews. Those
were great people to interview.
Yeah.
Did you watch Tom Chandler? He's been interviewed multiple times. Because of that, well, on my darkest day as dean, I called Tom. He said, I need help. I need a good lawyer. And I went in, and because of this whole history, that he was phenomenal, but I wouldn't have known him if I had just tried to gather it from a meeting or a breakfast or something.
Yeah.
And the ones done before versus there were layers and layers of these and an integrity. Something that held it all together.
Well, there's a depth to the story that you get through an oral history that you don't get when you're, talking with folks casually or maybe in a professional setting, right? When you have that intimate moment in oral history.
His mother, we have an award named after her. She was a Jehovah's Witness, And, talking about being poor during the Depression, but also finding out what this place was like during World War II. It was empty. And the guys who were here didn't want to, they wanted to be out, but there was some reason they couldn't serve. Just this morning, someone, woe is us, the budget for this, and I said, you know what, we survived that. We had to, and there's just knowing that there's a kind of resilience that comes from that. And now the privilege I have of working with tribes, I'm reminded again and again of friends there. You want to know about resilience? Knowing that not just as a story of loss, but a story of triumph, really, despite all those odds. The law school has its own. It hasn't always been rosy. We don't feel so special. We have the most unique, horrible problems of all time. Well, I kind of thought that recently, but other things. Last day there, I asked all of them, we did, what was your best day as a lawyer and your worst day?
Right.
You don't know how many said their best day. There was one guy, a button-down guy in a major farm in Phoenix, who every Wednesday, but no one knew this, disappeared and went and get away for a couple hours at the end of the day. And this came out, and just like as a facet of him that he didn't share with anyone. And so I have a lot of nieces and nephews who are lawyers now, and I said, don't leave that out. On your worst day, if you go, remember helping somebody in that way. The best lawyers I know from the range of practice backgrounds understood that component. So I learned that. Last night, I got a phone call. Hi, this is Elias Romley. Go to the Hall of Fame. Who he was. I've known every dean of the law school. I hear you're the new sheriff in town. He was on oxygen. We went up there to the den. He got dressed up like he's going to work. He sat there and told me he thought he was going to be a grocer, work in a grocery store. But there was this, we could touch them from that day all the way to the beginning through Elias. So his is one of those that we did get before he passed. Right, and just these people, that's why, if there's anything interesting there, it's because Elizabeth helped us with good prompts. And then we had great people.
I think that's an important part of it, right? Is putting those questions together, putting those prompts together to help sort of prompt the memory and have them begin their storytelling and begin to tell sort of their path to get where they are. And then connect that to what's happening today, and then connect that to sort of the next generation coming in.
You'll also not, it'll be hard to find a lawyer who doesn't, when asked, want to tell. I'm serious, touch me, I talk. But they have that opportunity too to speak back to the institution in a way that no one had asked before. And Nicole, you mentioned Nicole. Does she talk about when she threw the Conwell book at the wall because she was so frustrated by the material? Everyone else should listen to hers, right? Anyway,
Yeah. One of the shorter interviews, I think less than 30 minutes. And I think if I recall correctly, she had just taken the bar exam. So Nicole Davis. So Toni, actually, I was going to send a question to you, but you've kind of already answered it. So I'm going to share why I feel the Lives in the Law project is important. So as somebody who has no legal background, as an undergraduate who had no interest going north of Speedway other than to visit the Poetry Center, I think it is a way to show practitioners as people, the power that they do, and to let everybody know who interacts with the collection that a life in the law can be theirs as well if they so choose it. It is funny that Aengus mentioned Richard Davis, and I want to share a quote from his oral history as part of the project. And when he's talking about the law himself, or rather the practice of law. And I quote, "It's a job, it's an avocation. You don't have to get into a fist fight to be a good advocate. You don't have to try to destroy people to get your point across. But more importantly, remember that you're a human being and you have a life to lead. And you have a community out there that I think deserves the best you have to offer." So with that, I'm going to open it up for any questions that our audience may have. And anybody via Zoom is welcome to share those questions in the chat. Teresa.
Dean Massaro, did you ever use any of these oral histories in your teaching? here at the law school? If so, how? And if not, do you have any ideas? And maybe the other panelists also have some ideas for us to use the teaching.
I do, in a formal doctrinal class. I used it all the time in my interactions with students. I've been also one of the faculty advisors to Jack, Justice Advocates Coalition, and telling them about what I heard from all of these attorneys. But we did create a few pods that were designed to entice students to go to meets. And one of them was, what is it really like in a big firm? Or what does it mean to be a young associate in a private firm regardless of size? And we didn't measure, again, it was a very amateurish thing in a lot of ways, looking back. But that was an attempt to respond to the point that the curriculum has fissures or intricacies, things that nobody's teaching. And that the people in practice, like the kids, I'm sorry, you mentioned the students should know. And or be exposed to. We have many more clinical programs than we did back then, but not everybody takes them, and no clinic can do it exhaustively. Just a concrete Jan is in my head right now, wasn't it? An associate doesn't think about overhead. So as the small firm, they have no idea how the firm is sort of like faculty not knowing how law school, but what it means to run a place financially. I thought it was great. Because most of our students end up in a small firm, not a big firm, for government, which is a whole different theme. So, but if there were something we put together, a lunchtime talk series, sort of cullings for those kinds of things, it would be a lot of work, but I think it could be good for some students.
Barbara?
I conducted a bunch of interviews when I was writing a book about Marianne Mitchell. And I remember hearing from a woman who was also a judge, federal magistrate. She was very unhappy when the book came out because it quoted her as saying something that she did say. And I sent her the transcript of the interview, but I wonder if in these oral histories, if you always let them review what they said and correct it, or does that defeat the purpose of this kind of authentic voice at the time?
Aengus, yeah, please.
I have very strong feelings about this, which would irritate my fellow historians, because I also come to this from the background of radio and audio production. And I think kind of philosophically that we always recognize these things are constructed and the truth is always sort of abstract in there and you have to find it. So because of that, I don't let them go back and listen to things, but I do stop and I say, if you said something you regret, or if you said something that you misstated, I'll cut it out. And so I do that all the time. It doesn't usually become much of most people don't care. They might feel that they wanted something taken out at the end, they'll be like, we just talked for 4 hours, don't bother going back and finding that. But if you're talking to someone who had power, someone who, if they tell you something, people may say like, wait, you back 20 years ago, you say you knew this thing, they may want something taken out, and I take it out. I don't worry about saying like, well, you signed the release form, so it's all going in. I think a critical listener who's going back to this knows to some extent that a lot of it is just by our very nature as people, somewhat self-aggrandizing and not always accurate. And I hope that the listener listens critically. And when I talk to people about using oral histories as sources, I say, like, you need to really interrogate this stuff and corroborate. So because of that, I allow things to be happy.
Thank you, Aengus. Any other questions? Okay, well, with that, I guess we can conclude, and please join me in thanking our panelists again, Toni, Berlin, and Aengus, with another round of applause.